It's quite a revelation to realize that you've locked yourself out of the higher frequencies because you're caught in reactive or repressive shadow patterns. If you're interested in exploring more about what Richard Rudd of the Gene Keys just said there, then you've found yourself in the right place. Welcome to the Shadow Work Podcast. I'm Jessica DePazzi, and for the next at least 64 shows, I'm going to take you through this series that covers the spectrum of negative patterns in the human experience. Painting golden water, rosaries, where the sailors sing. As I was contemplating this next episode on reaction, I realized that there's this important aspect of this work that deserves its own standalone episode. Just to make things easy for you as you progress through this library of shadows, you can come back to this and get a little refresher. And that's this concept of your shadow manifesting its negative energy either inwardly or outwardly. So if you can imagine, there's a spectrum of shame and blame that we can all identify more strongly with on one pole or the other. Shame is over here on the left side, blame is over here on the right side, and this whole spectrum is just imagine it down low in the lower states when you're vibing really low. And you can, of course, express both versions of shame or blame, but based on your upbringing, your culture, your ancestry, and DNA, we're all just kind of naturally placed on one side more than the other. Now, I want to define some of these terms before I get too far in. If you're on the shame side of the spectrum, that's me, by the way. Richard Rudd, the author of the Gene Keys, identifies this as repressive, and he says that this is more of this introverted psychological expression of fear. If you're on the blame side of the spectrum, he calls this reactive. The blame nature is more extroverted and manifests as anger, which is really fear turned outwards. So shame, it's your inward expression of fear. Blame is anger, which is really your own fear turned outwards. I always feel a little bad for the blame people out there. They get a bad rap because it's such an outward expression of their lower states, when in reality, it's just as poor or negative and hurtful a shadow pattern as when your fear is reflected inward. And this is something I identified with my husband early on in our relationship. Often in relationships, whether it's romantic or friendships or business partnerships, because opposites attract, you usually call in people who are on that other side of the spectrum. It just creates a more balanced experience for you both. I know that there are couples out there that are just one type, but think if you're both blame people and you expressed your suffering outward, it would just be complete chaos every time one of you dipped down. And on the flip side, if you're both blame people or shame people, that would just be depressing. So I think you know where I'm getting to here. With balance like this, bringing a reactive and a repressive natured person together, it can also be really challenging since you have two different coping mechanism styles. So for my husband, when we were learning about our relationship and exploring this, whole universe of emotions and disagreements and how do we deal with all of that, I discovered that his whole life he'd been shamed because of his anger. Since he was little, he was always told that it was wrong, and that's definitely not the case. While being on that opposite side of somebody's anger is never fun, it's a human reality that we can express it inwardly or outwardly. And when you don't have the tools or you're not accepted for what you're brought into this world with, people get the tendency to try to stuff it down and be inauthentic. But, it doesn't take long before it explodes out of you a few times stronger than it needed to be. So anyway, I let him know that even though I'm not an outward anger person, I am an inward anger person. I am not a monk. And I love him not despite his coping style and not despite his angers, but because of it. And I can be the first one to love what he's deemed the most unlovable parts. And what that does is it levels a playing field. In fact, one of our wedding vows was that we both, am a safe place to project your fears. We actually got that from Brian Franklin and Jennifer Russell. They're just geniuses when it comes to romantic relationship dynamics, among a big handful of other things they're great at. And what that means is, while I'm not going to be a mother to your wounded child, I will be a playmate to your pre-wounded child, and I'll do my best to recognize when you're upset. And that is just your fears being expressed in the most authentic way possible. And that goes both ways, of course. I'm no stranger to getting pissed off. And so by really identifying that shame and blame are both just as low on the spectrum of consciousness, I'm able to let him into my head a little bit, show him the damage that I'm doing to myself, and he can see that he's not the bad guy he's always been told he was because he has an outward expression. He just has a different way of expressing his emotions. And one thing I also find with shame people is that we can get a little bit like high and mighty. You know, we're like, be a decent human, inflict your pain on yourself, you asshole. And that's because we've been told our whole lives that that's the good thing to do, to repress your anger, repress your fear. And if you, whatever goes on in your head, it doesn't bother other people. So just leave it there. And that's not what this shadow work is about. We are not here to hide. We're here to take this shit, use it as fertilizer so we can live our purpose and be the best versions of ourselves. And once you can honor your shadow expression style being either shame or blame, you can then create space for it. And if it needs to happen, then it happens. It's better to get it out than stuffing it back in. And little by little, you can identify the pauses in between when you're triggered and when you're starting to be a jerk to yourself or to be a jerk to somebody else. So as I progress through these shadow patterns moving forward, seriously, it's going to happen in the next episode, I promise, you'll see that the manifestations of the root causes will come in either a shame version of or a blame version. And these two things look very different in terms of how they're expressed. They're almost complete opposites. So it's fun to see how that works. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. And for those of you who are really enjoying this type of work, who want to ask themselves the hard, challenging questions and really dive into your life to see what you can, audit your life, what you can remove and what you can make space to open and accept for the next year or so, or even potentially the rest of your life, you can go to wayoftrials.com. That is our 12-week online course designed for self-discovery and elite training. It was developed by Jeff DePazzi, my husband, with the outward expression of fear. Sorry, Jeff. Rick Alexander and Aaron Guyette, produced by Luke Montgomery. And I'm also a contributor of that program. And it's truly next level, you guys. It'll give you lots of tools to navigate and surrender to life in the ways that are authentically you. So thanks for listening. If you have any questions about this or the program, you can hit me up at jessica@thespecialforcesexperience.com or Instagram at Jessica DePatie, DEPATIE _ Jessica DePatie _. All right, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you soon.